Hello, and welcome to another edition of Station Identification. This episode, and some of the ones that will follow, are going to have a little different purpose. I am, for all intents and purposes, essentially an educator. I've been doing teaching. Well, I always have been a teacher in some ways, whether it was helping friends catch up in classes growing up, working in libraries, being a professor. Teaching is just something that happens. And having this outpost on YouTube doesn't change that. So I'm going to use this outpost to put forth some video lectures, specifically ones on film. And as a historian, I'm going to talk about the history of American cinema. I am a proponent of what could be called the sage on a stage style of teaching, which means I just want to get up and talk about stuff, which is really, really ironic considering I suffer from horrible stage fright. But that's a story for another time. So, I'm putting together some film history lectures covering roughly the first 100 years or so of filmmaking. Now, the moving image has many starting points. My favorite is the notion that early people, early humans who put painted images on cave walls drew them in such a way that when viewed with flickering light from their fires, the images would appear to be animated. That always just struck me, that we were always trying to show moving images. As a technology, I would have to say the birth of motion pictures starts with a bet. Edward Muybridge set up a series of cameras to take pictures of a horse running. This was all to settle a bet about whether whether a horse kept all its feet, at least a foot, on the ground at all times. The 11 photos created a film image that proved that when running, horses didn't always touch the ground. Interestingly, the technique he used, which was a series of cameras that took a picture in order, would be a technique that was used by the makers of the film The Matrix to create what they called bullet time. So Muybridge was a pioneer, and he did a lot to greatly improve photographic equipment. However, the true beginning of cinema would come later in the 1800s, which this would include the work of Louis Le Prince, who created an early work called The Round Hay Garden Scene in 1888. But he himself disappeared under mysterious circumstances from a train, which would later lead to many conspiracy theories. Also, a pair of French brothers named Lumiere which I always thought was very fitting, a very fitting name for film pioneers, who were shocked when their black and white film of workers leaving their factory was more popular than the examples of color film they were mostly showing at the event they showed that film. And then there's William Dixon, who developed American filmmaking while employed by Thomas Edison. Edison, in turn, used Dixon's work to try to patent all forms of filmmaking in the United States. We'll put a pin in this, as it will become later very important. Maybe not in this lecture, but another one. From these beginnings arose a creative industry that by 2020 alone had a market of over $100 billion. In the time period from the creation of Le Prince's film in 1888 to the present, we've had 500,000 films of some sort have been created. And with the rise of digital technology, that number will probably be eclipsed. But at the turn of the century in 1900, no one could imagine that. Cinema was an interestingness. And what it brought to the masses was movement. Movement for a society that itself was moving. Technology was increasing at a dizzying pace. Electricity-powered lights, telephones, elevators, cars moved people through the modern age, and cinema was kind of a diary of that modernity. The first films detailed life. But as early filmmakers pioneered visual tricks, they then also began to present stories to keep crowds coming in. By the 1910s, American filmmakers are coming to the critical conclusion that they had to combine both spectacle to bring in crowds and story that kept those crowds returning. Now today, we look at those early films as crude or primitive, but that's more on us viewing those films after living through time where filmmaking has become more and more perfected. How the language of film permeates us. They, however, were coming up with the language of film. Now, it took 20 years for those filmmakers to turn movement into meaning, spectacle into emotion, and the technology into an art. Now, I do want to mention a bit on why we often view those films as primitive. Unlike the majority of the film era, cameras of the silent age were hand cranked. They had to physically move the film through the camera. And that can affect the showing. Now, eventually, 24 frames a second became the default film projector rate. Video rates are slightly different here in the US, where it's almost 30 frames a second. But if something is filmed at 24 frames a second and it's projected at 24 frames a second, it should all look the same. And as I said, as a side note, video rates are different here in the US. However, in England, they made their system the same. 24 frames for film, 24 frames for video. So they could actually film TV screens and it wouldn't look weird because their frame rates lined up. But if an American film from the past showed a TV, they either didn't bother and it had this kind of rolling banding that went through, or if the plot needed it to be clear, they jiggered the system. I remember when they would show movies about the moon landing and the video playback looked like crap. And part of it was due to the video running at one speed and the film being at another. Now, as I said, you crank the film through the projector. Now, it can get interesting if you start playing with that. This is how they started learning the language of film. If you overcrank or film at a higher number of frames, let's say 48 frames a second, but you project at 24 frames a second, you'll slow the film down. And conversely, if you film at 12 frames and project at 24 or under crank, you speed things up. Now, the terms seem back-assward, but think of it this way. If it normally takes 24 steps to cross a room, you cut that number in half, you cross the room in half the time. Double the amount of steps, you double the amount of time. Now, during the silent era, they were working out the proper speed of film. And because it was hand cranked, there were problems with consistency. And certain cameramen were sought out for their smooth ability to consistently crank. And they wouldn't record the speed of cranking down very well. So if you're watching an old film and it showed people walking funny, we, here in the more modern times, thought it was an issue of primitive machinery, when in fact it was user error on us. Once the proper crank speed was determined, the film looked just fine. Now, growing up, there was a pizza place known as Shakey's. Great pizza. And they projected old films on the wall to kind of create ambiance. And they were always jittery because they projected them at the wrong speed. But we accepted it because that's just how we thought they were. By the sound era, 24 frames a second became the standard. And it was the standard because it was good for being economical for film stock usage. And as they were working out sound, it was good for sound playback. I'll talk more about how sound and film works next time. Recently, Peter Jackson filmed his Hobbit movies at 60 frames a second, but he also projected it at that same rate, so people moved normally. However, because it was digital, the amount of detail was more, and the film rate being more frames per second meant there was more detail, and it had a different kind of look. It didn't look cinematic because for 100 years we were taught that 24 frames a second gave you that cinematic look. So, just some things to illustrate how they were learning how film worked. Now, next time we'll move into the 1920s and how filmmaking essentially grew up. So, I will see you next time on Station Identification.